listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast by Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, Dr. Frederick J. Long, Dr. Mario Melendez, Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and J. M. Smith. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, this is Dr. Jennifer Noonan. Welcome to this week's episode of SLA Insights. We're in the middle of this kind of a mini-series on language proficiency and what it is, defining it, looking at the component parts with an eye toward how do we get there ultimately. If you haven't listened to the previous two episodes, you may want to do those before watching this episode. But I will do a little bit of review to get us up to speed here. So as I said, we've been discussing language proficiency or proficiency in language acquisition. The first episode was on language proficiency generally. Last week's episode on implicit language knowledge. This week, I'm going to focus on explicit language knowledge and how that contributes to proficiency. In upcoming episodes, I'm going to compare implicit and explicit language knowledge and also talk about how there might be interface between them. If you have one, can you learn the other, for example? And then finally, automaticity, which is the third component of language proficiency, will be on some future upcoming episodes. So just by way of review, we've been using Holstein's definition of language proficiency and incorporating the three components that he describes in his definition. First, we're talking implicit knowledge of phonetics, prosody, phonology, morphology, and syntax. Second, proficiency involves vocabulary mastery, which is primarily explicit language knowledge. And then finally, we need automaticity to fuel those two types of language knowledge to bring about quick and efficient language use. So last week, again, I covered implicit knowledge, which is knowing what you know without having to think or reflect on what you know. It's the language knowledge you use every day in your native tongue without reflecting on rules. So we're not talking memorization of paradigms or grammar rules. That would be the explicit language knowledge, and that's what we're going to cover today. Now, briefly, explicit language knowledge is the conscious knowledge of grammatical rules and patterns in a language, including vocabulary, as I mentioned earlier. But I'd like to use a heavier definition given to us by Rod Ellis. Now, I know this is really dense. I'm going to go through it once, and then I'm going to go back and unpack some of the pieces of the definition a bit to help us fully understand what he's trying to say here. So from Rod Ellis, quote, "Explicit L2 or second language knowledge is the declarative and often anomalous knowledge of the phonological, lexical, grammatical, pragmatic, and sociocritical features of the L2 together with the meta-language for labeling this knowledge. It is held consciously and is learnable and verbalizable. It is typically accessed through controlled processing when L2 learners experience some kind of linguistic difficulty in the use of L2. End quote. So yes, that's dense. So let's unpack it, break it down just a little bit. He starts by saying explicit L2 knowledge is declarative. Declarative just meaning you can verbalize the grammar rules. So in English, we know, for example, that you add ed to a past tense verb to make it past tense. And we can say that out loud. That's the general rule of how to make a past tense verb in English. That's declarative language knowledge. He also says that it's often anomalous, which may sound strange to someone who has very systematically worked through a reference grammar in Hebrew or Greek and say, yes, I know every bit of systematically the grammar we need to know for this language. But let's think about how systematic it is in terms of usability. So it may not be the most useful knowledge you have. An example here, think about the feminine plural independent pronouns in Hebrew. How often do you use those? 5 times, maybe, in the whole Bible? But it's something that is often taught in the first couple weeks of Hebrew language class because they're going to teach the independent pronouns. All right, if we're going to teach the pronouns, let's teach all of them, including the feminine plural, which, that's anomalous language knowledge. You just really don't need it the first week of class. So continuing with Ellis's definition, it's the knowledge of the phonological, that is how the language is pronounced, lexical, talking about vocabulary, grammatical, grammar rules, pragmatic and sociocritical features of the language. I want to take just a minute to talk about that. These are the language features dealing with things like politeness and register. How do you speak in a certain context? In English, we don't speak with register so much unless we add please and thank you or sir or ma'am, something like that. But in languages like Spanish and French, the difference between the second person pronoun, do you use the tu form or the vous form? That would be an example of register. In Hebrew, using the long imperative or adding na, or even in Hebrew or Greek, using the third person circumlocution, such as, may my lord the king look with favor upon his servant. So rather than saying, hey, could you please do this for me, you use this long, elaborate expression in third person to get your point across. So those are pragmatic and sociocritical features of the language. He goes on to say that you learn all these features together with the meta-language for labeling this knowledge. Now, the meta-language is really just the names and labels that linguists give to analyze these various features of the language. Some examples of meta-language would be present, active, indicative, or pronoun, or hifil, or declension, or construct noun. These are all meta-language terms used to describe the conscious knowledge that you have of the language. Now, I want you to, just as a brief aside, notice that you probably did not learn meta-language for your native language, assuming English, until late elementary, maybe middle school, and by then you were clearly proficient in your native language. So just to be aware, you don't have to know meta-language to be proficient or fluent in a language. All right. Now, going back to Ellis, continuing with his definition, he says it is held consciously and is learnable and verbalizable. So we've talked a bit about that. You consciously, you know what you know, unlike the implicit knowledge where you may not know what you know. And it's learned and it's verbalizable. As above, you can talk about it. You know, you can say what you know. And then finally, he says it is typically accessed through controlled processing when L2 learners experience some kind of linguistic difficulty in the use of L2. Now, controlled processing, we're talking about using the language monitor. You're consciously using your explicit knowledge of the language or your grammar rules to fix when there's been a language breakdown or assist when there's been some sort of language difficulty. So, for example, let's say you're talking to someone in your L2 Spanish, and you suddenly realize that the person you're talking to isn't understanding what you're saying because maybe you said something that wasn't grammatically correct. So you stop, you consciously go back into your memory bank, find the rule about verbs, how is it you're supposed to construct this verb, or whatever it is you need, correct your utterance, and then get your conversation back on the rails. That's using a language monitor, your explicit knowledge of the language to fix your mistake and to move on. Now, people will often use the monitor before speaking or writing. They'll run it through, make sure they've followed all the grammar rules, check to make sure, yeah, that's how I say that. Okay, good. And then they use it. So that's another approach for using the language monitor. Make sure you fix any mistakes before they happen. But we also do something similar when we're using our receptive skills of listening and reading. So if we're listening in a conversation and there's a breakdown in communication, we can stop the speaker and say, hey, wait, say that again, or what do you mean, or I don't understand, and the person can say it again, or they might use explicit grammatical rules to say, no, I said this because in this way because it means this. But if we're reading a text, we can't do that. We can't stop and ask the text, what do you mean? We have to go find some other language knowledge, usually explicit language knowledge, to help us. A native speaker, if one's available, or more likely a dictionary, lexicon, reference grammar, Bible program, Google Translate, whatever it takes to help us get to the meaning of the text. And that's also a form of using monitoring to help us in our language use. So putting it all together, reviewing Ellis's definition one more time, he says explicit L2 knowledge is the declarative and often anomalous knowledge of the phonological, lexical, grammatical, pragmatic, and sociocritical features of the L2, together with the meta-language for labeling this knowledge. It is held consciously and is learnable and verbalizable. It is typically accessed through controlled processing when L2 learners experience some kind of linguistic difficulty in the use of L2, end quote. So that's explicit language knowledge. Now, how does this relate to ancient languages? What do we do with this? Well, first, vocabulary knowledge, and we're talking for anyone's vocabulary knowledge. First language, second language, ancient language, whatever it is, your language knowledge is primarily explicit. We consciously connect an object, an idea, an action with the word or phrase that represents it in the language. Now, we can retrieve some words faster than others, but this relates more to automaticity than it does explicit versus implicit language knowledge. Vocabulary is still largely explicit. So the payoff is spend time learning vocabulary, and the more the better. Learn it explicitly. Use your flashcards because, and here's a little insight to add to it, you can fudge your way through a text with lots of vocabulary and very little grammar. But the reverse is not true. You can know every bit of grammar in a sentence, but not know any of the vocabulary, and you won't get anything out of it. So maximize your time learning vocabulary. Now, in future podcasts, I'd like to spend some time talking about vocabulary learning, what's involved, how to maximize it, how to work with it. But for now, flashcards are a great place to start. So do it. Learn your vocabulary. Now, when we come to explicit grammar knowledge, however, this is where the explicit knowledge can become clunky and inefficient, really. If you're going to spend time needing to run everything through your language monitor, it just takes time. And research has shown you are also not as accurate or nuanced with our explicit knowledge as we are with our implicit knowledge. So what do we do with this? Well, we need to find ways to increase our implicit knowledge of grammar. And there's all kinds of ways we're going to do that. And future podcasts are going to look at from all different angles, how to increase your implicit language knowledge. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with gaining explicit grammar knowledge. It's just not going to serve you as well as the implicit knowledge. Next episode, we're going to do some further comparison and contrast with the explicit versus implicit knowledge, which is better, how do they work, but then also talk about interface. Can you gain implicit knowledge from your explicit knowledge? How do they relate to each other? How does that work? So that will be for next podcast. And then future, beyond that, we're going to get into automaticity, which is the third and final aspect of language proficiency. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Thank you. It's been great working with you, and I look forward to next week. Have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House. Language resources for the global community.